So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. We have a nice mix of members of the community and members of the Brown student community. We have an extraordinary opportunity here. We have Congressman Dean Phillips, who is a first-term congressperson, having just been elected, I believe, from the 3rd district in Minnesota. And we have David Cicilline, Congressman David Cicilline, who just got elected to his 4th term in office, right? 5th from the 1st congressional district. So what we've done is we've set up a circumstance where our 2 student moderators, Eamon and Jordan Allums, are going to ask questions. We're going to get right to it, and we're going to give each of the congresspeople a chance to talk a little bit about how they got to Congress, and I'm going to ask that first question. Then we have 2 questions from the student moderators. Then we'll have a 3rd question from the Sunrise Movement. And then we'll do a little bit of Q&A in between, and then we'll have a 4th question if we have time. The congresspeople have to catch a flight. They literally have to be physically out the door at 1:30, so I want to make sure to give everybody a chance to converse. Okay, so the first question is, can you briefly describe what about or what contributed to your path to Congress from your education at Brown? And generally, when you got to Congress, what was your biggest surprise? And so Dean Phillips just arrived, and Congressman Cicilline has been there for quite some time. And then coupled with that, how did you prepare in your first 2 years of Congress for being a congressperson?
So, I've only been here for 90 days, so
right.
I got a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, good. Hi, everybody, most importantly. I'll tell you, well, first of all, why did I do this? I woke up the morning after the 2016 election, and I was so disappointed about how we'd evolved in this country, our tenor and tone in politics and discourse. I watched the election that night with my daughters, who are now 21 and 19, and I promised them the next morning that I'd do something. I wasn't going to sit on the sidelines. This place taught me to not just watch and observe, but to act and participate. And lo and behold, here I am. When I was a student here, I never would have imagined that I'd run for Congress, let alone win and now be serving. And I'll say, if you listen, as I contemplate my path, as I reflect back on my Brown experience, I had one profound class and one profound book, and it was called "And the Band Played On" by Randy Schultz. It was about the AIDS epidemic, and this is, mind you, in the late '80s, and it fundamentally changed me, and it taught me how to be bothered, and it taught me that no matter how much trust I was raised to have in my government and the people who operated it, that truth was more important and not always available to all of us. And that's in no small part why I decided to run for Congress. I think we are now in a day and age where truth is harder to discern. Social media has complicated matters. And I didn't want to sit on the sidelines anymore. And this place gave me some outstanding gifts of both people in my life who inspired me, professors to whom I'm forever indebted, and I'm very humbled to be here. And now you asked about my first 2 years. I've only been in Congress for 90 days. My epiphanies are as follows. First and foremost, there's a lot more collegiality between members of both sides of the aisle than you might imagine. If you only watch Fox News or MSNBC, I'm sure it's more of the latter here, you wouldn't ever know that. And the leadership offices in both parties tend to be bottlenecks, but the relationships on the floor, if you will, actually make me somewhat optimistic. The second epiphany is that we have a system designed to make change really difficult, and it works really well. And that's something we have to acknowledge. Some of the things that troubled me and bothered me the most about our system of governance are actually the things now that I appreciate. And it begs for a different approach to doing things. And as someone who has spent much of his professional life in the executive capacity, being a legislator is a little bit more complicated, but very, very enriching. So those are a couple of my epiphanies, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, David.
Thank you. I feel really lucky to have Dean here and to be a member of this freshman class that brought us into the majority, and it's great to be on this panel with him. So for me, I was interested in politics from a very young age. Before serving in Congress, I served as mayor of this city for 8 years, and before that, 8 years in the state legislature, so I'm a career politician, I guess you could say. But what really motivated me to run for Congress was, as a mayor, it was very clear to me that Washington really didn't understand cities and didn't understand what a good partnership meant and how federal policy could really impact in a productive way, a positive way, cities. And so when my predecessor, Patrick Kennedy, decided not to run for re-election, I saw it as an opportunity to take the lessons of the last 8 years as mayor and bring those to Washington and hopefully create policies that would help cities thrive, not only here in Rhode Island, but across the country. Brown definitely played a role in my interest in politics. I mean, I was interested in it as a young person, but when I came to Brown, I formed the College Democrats, which was my classmate at the time, John Kennedy, and Bill Mondale, who was a year behind us. There was no college Democrats here. I think there was like college Republicans, college communists, but no college Democrats. So, and we got involved in some local races here, which caused some controversy because we got involved in some Democratic primaries. But I was also involved in student government here, and it reinforced, as Dean mentioned, the understanding that if you're going to affect change, you have to be in the game, you have to be involved, you have to engage, and running for office seemed like an obvious way to do it. I just want to acknowledge Bernie Bonanno, who's here, who's not only a Brown alum and a great friend of Brown, but has been a wonderful friend to me and a supporter of mine all along my political travels. So thank you for being here, Bernie.
Smith Bonanno, that man, Smith Bonanno.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, biggest surprise?
Yeah.
Biggest surprise to me was how much influence money had on our political system. I sort of read a little bit about it, and as a mayor and a state legislator, you see a little bit of it, but it became really clear to me the power of special interest money in our elections when you see the way that lobbyists and special interests influence the development of public policy in a way that really shocked me.
Thank you.
Yes.
Jordan Allums.
Yes, thank you so much for those fascinating answers. So in the spirit of local politics, as House members, you both represent more local constituencies in your districts. So my question is, how do you balance your local representation responsibilities with national issues?
It's a challenge. I'll confess that I spent most of my adult life and frankly teenage life in the city of Minneapolis, which faces very different circumstances and the people that live in it than the district, the wealthy suburban district that I now represent just outside of Minneapolis. And I think when you are sworn into Congress and you take that oath, you recognize that you are there to serve your constituents in your district, but this is also about the greater good. And it's something I have to remind myself every day, and that's why, and frankly, to David's words about money in politics, Washington is a very easy place to get drawn into, sucked into, because of all the influences that are trying to pressure you into doing not what is right for the country, but it was right for their interests, most of them fueled by lots of money. And it's something I think every one of us face on a daily basis. Too many people focused on trying to get reelected, which means often they will take votes and issue quotes that diverge from their own personal principles or those certainly that the country represents. So it's complicated, to be forthright. But at the end of the day, this is about the greater good, and we've never needed more members that looked at it the same way.
Yeah, so I'd say, I think my training as a mayor has informed the way I think about that question. And that is that, I think representing people in the district that I represent is not at all inconsistent or different from what I do in Washington. I do think you have a responsibility as a member of Congress, and I think this is true for most members, to spend lots of time in your district at local events, giving people who you represent an opportunity to speak to you directly about the things that are important to them. A lot of elected officials sort of think of that as, oh, those are events you go to, as if it's an annoyance or they don't really like to do it or it's an add-on to the job. I think it's important to think of that as a central part of the job because it gives you an opportunity to hear every day very directly from the people you serve about what's happening in their lives, what they care about, whether they agree with you or disagree with you. It's a constant focus group that really informs your work. So I do a lot of that because as a former mayor, you kind of go to a lot of things. But it's really useful and I think important in terms of setting the priorities of my work in Washington and making sure that people are aware of what I'm working on and that I'm aware of what their priorities are. I think the other thing is you know, it's always important, the work that you're doing in Washington, to make sure, if it's not always immediately obvious to your constituents why it matters. So part of, I think, your responsibility as a member of Congress is when you're talking back home about the things you're working on, making that connection of why it matters in their lives. And, you know, you find that most of the stuff you're working on are things that matter in the lives of the people you represent. So I just think constant engagement, thinking about lots of opportunities to be hearing from your constituents and sharing the work that you're doing with them.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. My next question would be, how should educational institutions in your district interact with local, state, and the national government?
So I'll go first, because I had some interesting opportunities with Brown University actually when I was mayor. So yeah, I mean, yeah. So I'm a big believer that universities have a responsibility to play a really active role in the civic life of the cities in which they are located, and they are enormously powerful agents of change and can really, in a transformative way, contribute to the vitality of a city. And so I think, as you know, I've always taken a very broad view of what universities and colleges should do. We're really lucky to have great colleges and universities in Rhode Island that make enormous contributions. There's always a little bit of tension at the local level between local governments who are, you know, principally rely on property taxes for their resources, and great universities who contribute enormously to the economy of cities and to the economy of states, but most of it happens through income taxes for people who work at the universities. And of course, income taxes go to the state. So there's always this tension of like, there's a lot of economic value in terms of the revenues, if you think about it just in terms of revenues, but they principally go to the state. The municipalities are the places that have the responsibilities of providing police and fire protection and all the services, and yet the resources. So there's always a little healthy tension. So when I was mayor, I'll tell you a really funny story. I had this great idea of assessing I think it was a $250 annual public safety fee to college and university students who lived in the city of Providence. You know, I mean, colleges have 20 fees on their thing. If one more, people wouldn't even notice it. It would be a huge benefit to the city. And, you know, it seemed like a reasonable thing to do since police and fire protection was being provided to college students and they weren't really paying for that. And so they were, you know, it was poorer people in the city were actually subsidizing police and fire protection for college students. It seemed like a sensible idea to me. So I brought in all the leaders of the student government here at Brown. I had them at dinner at my house because I thought if the proposal came from the students, it would really be smart, you know, and I, you know, argued to them about their kind of responsibility, and they were all on board until Ruth Simmons, the former president of Brown, found out about the dinner and then brought them in and gave them a memo of all the stuff Brown has done for the city and all the contributions Brown makes to Providence. And they came back to the second dinner like absolutely not supporting the idea. But it didn't end up going, and we came up with an alternative where Brown and all the other colleges and universities make some payments to the city in lieu of taxes. Of course, they argue, and they're right, they contribute enormously to the city in so many different ways. But as mayors and as city officials, you have to deal with that kind of inability to generate revenue to do that. But the truth is, the real value of great universities, in my view, in cities is what they contribute to the civic life of the city, the talent of their professors and staff, of the students that are here that are interning and mentoring, and obviously the economic impact of a great big organization like this has on the city and the state is really tremendous. So President Paxton has been such a great partner with the city and really thinking about ways that Brown can become more deeply engaged in economic development and in planning and a whole range of activities. So I think universities have both a responsibility and a great opportunity to play a really important role in the civic life of the cities. And I think, frankly, the thing that distinguishes, you know, average cities from great cities is the presence of great universities.
Yeah, and I concur with David. First and foremost, I think education generally, I think is best, especially when it comes to higher education, decisions best left to the states. I think better understand their populations and needs and opportunities and can provide them. From a federal policy perspective, I'll tell you something that's on my mind increasingly, and I think perhaps it should be on everybody's, which is just as we have the aggregation of extraordinary resources, economic resources, in the hands of fewer and fewer in this country. The same is true with higher education. As you well know, institutions of higher learning in this country are aggregating tens of billions of dollars in their endowments, only required to share employ, if you will, 5% of that annually, which means they are going to continue to grow and grow and grow. The rich will become richer. Despite that, we have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of American young people who wish to achieve education, who can't afford it or can't access it. And I think this nation has got to come to grips with that. And that is where federal policy intersects to some degree now with higher education. And my question is, should we require that perhaps a little bit more be invested, shared, or distributed in some way more than 5%?
Thank you very much.
Now we have a question from the Sunrise Group. Who's the designated?
It's wireless.
This is a full service. You know, we're public
There you go.
servants.
Oh, wow.
Look at that. It's,
Background. We had intended to ask the Congressman about climate change and about the impact on the environment, and so we've decided that the Sunrise Movement has a couple of questions on that same subject, so we're going to open it up to them to ask questions.
Thank you. So I'm Mara, this is Lauren. We're here with representatives of the Sunrise Movement. Congressman Cicilline, it's good to see you again. I interned in your office a few years ago, and welcome back to Brown. And we're here to thank you for your bold and consistent climate leadership in Congress, from last December signing on to the Select Committee for a Green New Deal, and this February being one of the original co-sponsors on Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's resolution for a Green New Deal. So as your former intern and your constituent and a young person, I'm really proud of you, and thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, and while Congressman Phillips, David Cicilline has been really strong and vocal champion on the Green New Deal, you have yet to co-sponsor Congressman Ocasio-Cortez's resolution. And given your strong platform on climate and jobs, racial and economic inequality, I'm wondering today why you have yet to join nearly half of the Democratic caucus in the House in co-sponsoring the resolution for a Green New Deal.
Sorry.
By the way, I was going to interject as my professor type. This is a phenomenally important question moving forward for the Democrats, but also in learning for a fresh person congressman going to Congress, figuring out what to co-sponsor, and also your generation. So it encompasses so much of what we want this forum to be about. So thank you
Right
for the question.
on. Most importantly, I want to say thank you, because Sunrise, like a lot of youth-led movements around the country, are affecting extraordinary change, and I want to celebrate you, first and foremost. And as someone who has driven an electric car for 7 years, has a geothermal system in his house, has invested in clean energy companies, is co-sponsoring Ted Deutsch's bill, the carbon fee and dividend bill, I care. And as a father of 2 daughters myself, you know, I want them to grow up in a nation very different than the one that we live in right now. So your question is, why haven't I signed on? And my rationale is just because of who I am. And I'm pragmatic. And I want to see, I was taught by a 90-year-old man when I was, the first time I served on a board of an institution in Minneapolis, a healthcare board. I was kind of a young gun, and I wanted to affect a lot of change right away, and I had all these bold ideas. And this man approached me afterwards, and he was about 90-some years old, and he took out a rubber band. And he said, "Son, what happens if you stretch the rubber band too much?" I said, "Well, of course, it snaps." And he says, "What if you inch it along?" He said, "You'll always end up where you want to go, but you just got to do it incrementally," which I know is a dirty word when it comes to changing things that need change fast. But if we're going to do this, it's going to get done only with Republican support. And right now, there's a Republican in the White House. We have a Republican-controlled Senate. That will be the same thing 18 months from now. So what I'm doing is some of the down and dirty work, if you will, co-sponsoring bills that I think actually stand a chance, doing my own research and homework, trying to build coalitions with people who are actually very like-minded on the other side of the aisle. But because of the dynamic that we have right now in our politics, because of the way that the Green New Deal was introduced, every single Republican is opposed to it, despite the fact that just about every element of it is not just reasonable, it's important. But so much, and this is another epiphany I should have shared with you when I first entered Congress, is the recognition that despite what you dream about, what we will be measured on is what we actually achieve. And I respect those who have signed on, including my colleague David. I respect what you're pushing all of us to do. I believe in the same thing, the same outcomes, just a little bit of a different path to get there. And I think the work I'm doing will be just as important as the ones of the people out front right now co-sponsoring the Green New Deal as any, because my job is working behind the scenes to actually introduce these ideas and find ways to get our more conservative colleagues on board. And if we can take back the White House in 2020 and hopefully flip the Senate, we could actually do these things. And that is the only reason why.
Yeah, and if I could just add one thing, I think it's really important to say that there's no disagreement about the underlying policies. Within the Democratic caucus, there's really unanimous support for addressing the urgency of climate change and being responsible. I think there's some disagreement about strategies and tactics, but there's no disagreement. You should know, and I know you do, that we're fighting against a Republican caucus that, by and large, resists the science of climate change and is, sort of bought and sold by big fossil fuel. I mean, so there's a real contrast between a Republican caucus that is unwilling to acknowledge the science, that is unwilling to move forward in any meaningful way on any of these issues, and maybe some disagreements within the Democratic caucus about kind of what are the best strategies, how bold, et cetera. But there's real consensus that we have to address this issue in a very serious way and in a bold way. And I think Dean is right. It's going to require kind of pushing on different paths to get there, and to the extent that we can get some Republican support to move some pieces of it and then get it moved in the Senate, that's great. My view is sort of be pushing boldly on the Green New Deal, but I think you should be made aware that there is absolute consensus within the Democratic caucus on the necessity of taking bold action to respond to the dangers of climate change. I think people have different ideas of what I think the most effective way to get there, but it is a very strong contrast from what our Republican colleagues have been doing, supporting rolling back of environmental protection, deregulating all kinds of dangerous activities, changing the mileage standards, and the list goes on to really take us back, drilling in the Arctic, drilling off the coast of New England. I mean, the proposals that come out of this White House that would really take us in very different directions.
If I may just say one more thing, it's incumbent on all of us to try to attract more interest, not by condemnation, but by invitation. We have got to collectively find the way to make the conservative case to do exactly what we're all arguing for, which is something I'm trying to do right now. Absent that, this will be political objection only, and we have got to transcend that. And every one of you and every one of us has a role to play in that. But I ask that we start looking at it that way. How do we invite people to the table, have these discussions, and most of all, not start with tactics, because that is the circumstance in which every single bit of thoughtful legislation usually finds a dead end. We have got to identify the outcomes that we all agree to and share, which is far more than you'd imagine, and then work our way backwards with the tactics to get there. That is the solution, if you ask me, to effecting resolution for climate change and a lot of problems in our country.
I have a question for the Sunrise Movement on this, and then we'll move to another topic. So let me ask you something. I'm not as familiar with your cross-state collaboration efforts. And I guess what I see is a gap between what you're trying to do and your efforts and what the Congress people are saying, as not just to mention age, but also just how do you pressure people who live in Minnesota? How do you pressure people who live in Iowa? How do you pressure people who live in Texas or Oklahoma or North Dakota? Tell me a little bit, how do you need help or expect leadership from the Democratic Party in how to persuade or talk to people who live in the states that are represented by Republicans? Because that to me seems to be the missing link, and I don't know enough about it. So, yeah, we have a microphone. We do.
Thank you, Congressman. Oh, perfect. Thank you. So thanks for that. I just want to reiterate that the Sunrise Movement is a national movement that utilizes distributed organizing. So what that means is that we're folks from Rhode Island who are part of Sunrise Movement, but there are hundreds of hubs across the country. So a few of us were actually just in DC a few weeks ago with dozens of youth from Kentucky who came all the way from Kentucky to DC to protest outside of Mitch McConnell's office. So there are people in every state who are taking up this fight. There are people in every state who are calling on their congressfolks to sponsor this resolution. So I would say that that work is being done. It's about amplifying those voices and ensuring that every congressperson is hearing from someone in their state who's taking up the call that Sunrise is putting out. And Sunrise has only been around for about a year and a half, so the growth that we've seen is already enormous. The other thing I would say is that Sunrise across the board really calls on Congress people to look past incrementalism as any sort of room for this as the answer to what we can do to respond to climate change. So to answer your question as to how Congresspeople can work with Sunrise Movement, I would say listen to the young people across the country who are calling on them to sponsor the resolution.
Okay, thank you. And if we have time, we can return to this, but I do want to move to other issues that we have other questions prepared for. Thank you so much. Jordan, do you want to ask your question now?
Yeah, sure.
Or our
So,
questions?
yeah, in the spirit of getting feedback from the community and also democratic unity, which you were talking about, Congressman Cicilline, you were also saying earlier how part of the work of a congressman is to go to community events and understand what's going on in their daily lives. And part of that ranges depending on background, racial background, economic background. So as the 2020 campaign gets underway, how do you believe identity politics will affect Democratic Party unity in the Democratic caucus in the House? And how will that spill over to the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination?
Well, the first thing I say is I don't use the word identity politics because I think that's a very offensive term to a lot of communities because it suggests that there's something wrong with reflecting on a person's life experiences, whether it's based on gender, race, ethnic origin, sexual orientation, or whatever. So I do think the Democratic Party will continue to be the party that is fully inclusive and that will advance policies that benefit the American people broadly, and obviously recognize that we have, special responsibilities to address, institutional racism and a whole range of discrimination against marginalized communities. But I hope the Democratic Party will always be the party that welcomes, a broad cross-section of people. We have a caucus in the Congress now that is the most diverse caucus in our history, with the majority of members that are from communities of color, women, and members of the LGBTQ community. It is a very different demographic than the Republican caucus. So it really does reflect the diversity of America. So I think, our policies should reflect policies that are good for everyone. And I think one of the things that we tried to do in the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee was to develop an economic agenda that spoke to the economic anxieties of the American people in every congressional district in the country, and that had a set of priorities that worked for everyone running in any congressional district in America. And obviously people were free to add on other issues, but it was a kind of core and very inclusive economic agenda. And I think the Democratic Party draws its strength from being a party that is so diverse and that represents so many different communities. It also presents its own challenges. The Republican Party, if you look at the Republican caucus in Congress, it is predominantly old white men. And they have a lot of kind of similar life experiences. They use the same language. So it's easier to kind of have a coherent message when you have a bunch of folks that are very similar and have a lot of same. It's more challenging when you have people from all over with very different religious traditions and ethnic backgrounds and sexual orientation and gender identity. And so, while it's a great strength of our caucus, it makes us have to work a little harder in trying to build consensus around key agenda items and messaging. But we're still much better off for it because I think it reflects America, and that's what we want.
Yeah, and Congressman Phillips, if you would mind offering your point of view as a new member of Congress.
I agree with everything that David just said. Our diversity is our strength, but I will also say that we have got to start paying attention to people in the broad middle of this country, on farms and in rural communities, and who feel entirely disconnected from the policy priorities that we talk about every day in Congress. And this is just true. I come from Minnesota, which is an interesting, it literally is in the middle of the country. A major economic hub in the city. I represent suburbs, and just to the west of me, it's farmland. So I literally live in the middle of it. And I can tell you that increasingly people who live in rural areas don't quite understand how this party that is supposed to represent everybody seemingly doesn't represent them anymore. And I don't think it's a disconnect from policy. I think it's a disconnect from intentionally going to listen to them. And that's one of our opportunities as I look at you in the Sunrise Movement, which I really admire. That's where these invitations have to start. How do you reach out to 4-H clubs around America and invite conservative young people to the conversation? Because climate change is going to affect farms. But when when they wonder right now, how am I going to replace in 10 years, going to convert my tractor from using diesel fuel to somehow electric power? We don't make the case because we're spending all of our time and energy talking and listening, frankly, I would argue, to too many people on both coasts and ignoring a significant part of this country. So that, I think whoever secures the Democratic nomination for president has got to become not just mindful of it, but pragmatically speaking, if Democrats are going to win the White House in 2020, I think it's going to be incumbent on the nominee to spend a lot of time in parts that have been ignored for some time in the last number of years.
Thank you.
So the next question is, going off of the questions during the question and answer period, what are your views on climate change and how do you believe it is currently affecting your state? And then how are you preparing for that?
Well, I think what we're going to do is, since we've done that, I think we're going to go to the next question, which is related to that you wanted to ask, which is economic development. So how can members of Congress help facilitate economic development, particularly in impoverished areas and areas of the country that have been hit hard by trade losses and loss of jobs and jobs being shipped overseas and who don't have a livable wage? So what's the role of members of Congress? That was Eamon's in particular question. That would be our next question. So how do members of Congress help to address those very, very vital things in terms of
Well, I mean, one thing we can do is we can at least not make the problem worse. So, for example, we can negotiate trade deals that not only are beneficial to the economy of our country, but that also are important to protecting American jobs, raising the wages of American workers, and have trade deals that have enforceable environmental standards and labor standards. So, part of it is through our trade negotiations and our trade deals to actually have an objective of not only having a trade deal that's beneficial to the GDP of the country broadly, but to ensure that all of the benefits don't go to the very people at the very top, and that you, in that process, protect workers, protect labor rights, protect environmental rights. We can also use our tax code. We just passed it. Dean wasn't there, otherwise he would have prevented it from happening. But the Republicans passed a tax bill in the last Congress that virtually made all these problems worse. 83% of the tax cut went to the top 1%, to the richest people in this country and the most powerful and successful corporations. It was unpaid for, and the Republicans proposed cutting Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security and Pell Grants to pay for it. It made more generous the incentives that companies have to ship American jobs overseas. So one thing we could do is we could reverse that. I have a bill in the House, Senator Whitehouse has in the Senate, to actually give incentives to companies who create jobs in America rather than give incentives for people that are offshoring jobs. We can create policies that incentivize investments in underserved areas. That might be the only one tiny thing that was good in the tax bill, are these opportunity zones, which I'm fearful is just going to produce huge winnings for investors already making a lot of money, but there may be some incidental benefit to communities. But I guess my point is use of the tax code, use of trade agreements with an objective to actually raising family incomes and creating good paying jobs in this country ought to be the driver. And unfortunately, I think what we see, in part because of the influence of money in our political system, we have folks that are working very hard for the benefit of the wealthiest people in this country, the most profitable corporations. And very often when people say to me, Washington isn't working, and I say, oh, it is working. It's just not working for you. It's working for the special interests and the big lobbyists and the big multinational corporations just fine. And what we have to do is get Washington working for the people of this country again.
And I believe that we have a country right now in which the zip code in which you're born is way too much of a determinant of your economic outcome than it should be. And we can and should be a country that ensures equal opportunity is provided to all. We cannot guarantee outcomes, but I think we can guarantee opportunity. How to achieve that? Not everything costs a lot of money, and I concur with David's remarks about providing incentives. The education, the achievement gap, I think a lot of that has to do with the exposure gap. We're not exposing young people, especially in disadvantaged, underserved communities, to possibilities. Most have never seen what a classroom like this looks like. Most have never seen the inside of a factory, gone inside an airport, visited a forest for a 2-day camping weekend, seen what an advertising agency looks like, have never been in a hospital to see what it's like to be a doctor. If you don't give a young person the opportunity to light the match of a dream, there's no frickin' way it can become a bonfire. And I think that's how we begin. We've got to start exposing young people, because I guarantee you, just like I'm sure all of us at this table and all of you, I remember a lot more about the field trips, the things that took me out of school, than I remember the things that I did in school. And that's where my dreams were lit. So that's one. Secondly, opportunity to training and education. Yes, we can do better and we should do better, and darn it if we don't get to it. Because how can we prepare people for the jobs of the 21st century if we're using 19th century teaching mechanisms to train still over half of this country? Third, incentives, starting with entrepreneurship. I'd like to see every major city in this country have offices of entrepreneurship. So young people who want to open a food truck or a barber shop or any sporting goods store can go to one office and have a mentor, coach them through how you develop your business. And most importantly, access to capital. You know, we are great in America at sending resources abroad, microfinance. We have NGOs, massive NGOs that look overseas to help give young people a chance with microgrants. And yet we don't even deploy those same mechanisms in our own country. And then fourth is incentives. We should be, it is hard, a $15 minimum wage on the national basis, while I would like to see it a lot higher than that, in my estimation, is actually really problematic in the short term. What we should do in the short term is provide incentives to businesses who do pay $15 an hour, because incentives change behavior much more. So think about the carrot changes behavior faster than the stick. And if we as a country would look at that in a more holistic manner, I think we'd achieve a whole lot more, a lot faster.
Completely agreeing with Dean about one thing. I actually agree with everything he said, but one other tool that we have, and I have some legislation to do this, there are a number of bills that do this, and actually there's been a discussion here in Rhode Island about this same issue, and that is, I think it's called the Freeloaders Legislation, but essentially it says, if you're an employer who pays your employees so little that they're eligible for LIHEAP and food stamps and Medicaid, basically the American people are subsidizing your workforce. And it's outrageous. And so there's legislation we've proposed that says, if you don't pay your workers enough that they're eligible for these federal programs, you're going to be assessed a tax or penalty to offset the cost of that, because we're subsidizing your employees because you don't pay them enough and they're eligible for all these government programs. So I think it used to be that we relied on businesses to behave in a certain way, kind of before 1970, this sort of virtuous cycle, wages went up, profits went up, the owners of the company made more, so did the workers, and it was shared prosperity. That the in the early 70s to this whole kind of stockholder-driven, value of the stock. And I think we have the ability to enact legislation that will cause people to behave in that way that they used to, that recognizes we all benefit when you share the prosperity. Productivity has gone up dramatically, and the wages have gone up in a very, very small way. So all of the benefit of that increased productivity has gone to the owner, to the top 1%. So we can, it would be better if people could just remember that kind of virtuous cycle where everyone benefited. And in those days, the average CEO of a company made about 40 times the average worker. Today, it's like 390 times. So we've seen this tremendous concentration of economic power and wealth at the very top. It'd be nice if those behaviors just came back. But in lieu of that, I think Congress has the ability to actually legislate some of that.
And back in incentives, some of you might have read just this month, Norway, for the first time, I think the first time in history, in Norway last month, they sold more electric cars than gasoline-powered cars. And you'd imagine, why Norway of all places? Very simply, because they have incentives. And the incentives have reached a point where it is more favorable to drive an electric vehicle than it is to drive a fossil fuel-powered vehicle. And that's how you affect change instantly. So as we contemplate how do we change behavior, provide incentives to change the behavior. And by so doing, that's actually that's the miraculous way that Democrats and Republicans can agree, because Republicans don't want Democrats, quote unquote, imposing our values on them. But we can all agree climate change, well, most of us are agreeing climate change is real. We can agree on just about all the outcomes that we desire as a country. We get mired down in the tactics. So if we create incentives, let people choose. So I'm a fan of a public option for healthcare in this country. Let Americans choose if they want Medicare as their plan or a private plan or an individual plan. provide incentives and choice, because if Republicans see that we're providing the freedom to make a choice and we're actually increasing competition, it's amazing what might happen. So I'm focused very much on using incentives to change behavior quickly in this country rather than mandates, which are a lot more complicated to pass.
Thank you very much. I want to open it up to questions because we only have a few minutes. So let's open it up to the audience for questions. And yes, sir.
Cool. So this is for David. Providence has a problem with lead water.
With what, please?
Providence has a problem with lead water. I'm sure you're aware.
Oh, yeah.
Thing that's true also is that Providence Water, the company that manages lead pipes in the city, doesn't spend a lot on this issue, partly because there's not a ton of money at the state level. Have you thought about pushing for federal funds to help solve this problem?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, water systems, both water treatment and water delivery, not only in Providence, but in municipalities all across Rhode Island and all across the country, is a very serious issue. When we do an infrastructure plan, you will see a significant investment in upgrading water systems. The public health consequences for a place like Providence are significant, but there are examples of it all across the country. And it's in part because we have water systems that have pipes that are sometimes 100 years old. So really investing in a serious way to upgrade the water treatment facilities and water systems is critical. And, this is one where we hope we'll have some consensus within the Republican caucus and with this president. The problem is when the president first announced his infrastructure plan, it was a very small plan. It was basically relying on these public-private partnerships and basically the federal government kind of retreating from its full partnership role in infrastructure. And what I know from being mayor is cities just don't have the resources to do this alone. The federal government has to provide substantial resources to be successful in whether it's this kind of infrastructure or roads or ports or transit systems. So when we bring forward an infrastructure plan which will include resources for this, it will be with the federal government being a real partner again and providing really substantial resources to do it. We originally designed a $1 trillion infrastructure plan that would help to create 16 million good-paying jobs with a significant investment in water, which is an issue, as I said, not only here, but in many places across the country.
We have a history in this country of being really excited to build new buildings and new roads and new pipes and new lines and new houses. But when it comes time to replace the roof of a house, which nobody really sees, it's amazing how then nobody wants to pay for it. Just as homeowners don't want to pay for a new roof. We are guilty of that on a national basis, and have to recognize, we are a much younger country than a lot of our peers on the other side of the Atlantic and around the world. And this is the first generation of infrastructure that has now reached its useful end. And we have to reckon with it. Another example of something that unfortunately is not on the minds of enough people yet, and we have to elevate it.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
We can hear you.
Yeah, it's all good. So recently, the Democratic Central Campaign Committee, also known as the DCCC, announced that they would not be supporting any Democrats who challenge in primary Democratic incumbents. And I wanted to receive what your thoughts were on that. Because let's keep it into perspective that we would not have someone like Representative Ocasio-Cortez had she been prevented by the Democratic Party and or their affiliates to not challenge incumbent Joe Crowley.
Go ahead.
First thing is, I regret that this is a public fight because I think for those of us who served in the minority for the last 8 years and welcome our new freshman class that brought us into the majority, that we understand deeply the consequences of being in the minority versus the majority. Everything we care about is at stake if we're not in the majority. So I feel like this is an issue which could have been resolved if there had been sort of a family conversation rather than a public fight about this. And look, we have lots of new colleagues that came about as a result of challenging incumbents, and they're great. And the Democratic Party is never going to be the party that doesn't welcome new ideas and new people. And so I think it's regrettable because I think the reality is, there are going to have to be funding decisions that are made all the time. But we want to make it clear that the Democratic Party is always interested in bringing the best talent, the best candidates. I've had a primary every time I've run for office. That will continue. Like, that's the nature of it. And I do think there's a lot more agreement between folks that are talking about this. And my hope is it'll get resolved in a way that makes it clear that we're going to be smart about the way we use our resources to stay in the majority, but also going to be smart about being a party that continues to attract the best candidates and best people who are free to run and make contributions. And, some of the people we have now are terrific. And, I don't know how much help they got from the DCCC anyway, but I just think, this is the kind of stuff which frankly is self-inflicted wounds, which we don't need as a party.
And I'll start at the very root of the problem, which is money. This is all about the frickin' money, and everybody here should know it. I was appalled by it. David started his remarks with the money. It's appalling, and it has only become more so since I've become a member of Congress. When I decided to run, I made the decision I wouldn't accept any PAC money of any kind, no special interest money, no federal lobbyist money, and I wouldn't accept money from my fellow members of Congress or their committees for one simple reason, not because I didn't want it or in many cases or didn't even agree with a lot of the organizations or people that would have shared their resources, but I wanted to make decisions completely independent of influence whatsoever, including leadership decisions, which is frankly a big way of how things work inside the caucus and the Republican conference. So going back to the money, current members of Congress share a lot of resources with, in this case, the DCCC, and on the Republican side with the NRCC. They pay dues. Those who raise a lot of money share a lot of dues. They have the right to say, look, if I'm sharing a lot of money with you that I raised, why would you then in turn spend that money to defeat me? And I think all of you in the audience would understand that notion. So I'm going to argue, let's go a lot higher level, and let's look at the money in politics. We've got to affect change. Races in Canada for MP, members of parliament, are capped at $170,000 a year. My race, I'm a freshman member of Congress, I had to raise $6 million. My race cost over $20 million, and it will probably do the same thing 2 years, not even 2 years hence, 18 months hence. And the dirty little secret is a lot of our colleagues spend 30 hours a week walking across the street to call centers and dialing for dollars. And who do you call? Who do you call when you dial for dollars? Not the $5 donors or the $10 donors. You call the $2,500 donors. And this is all about money. So if we all want to get together and work on something that has to change and eliminate a lot of these questions that will increasingly be posed, let's start focusing on the money and the relentless pursuit of it by both members of current members of Congress and those who want to become members. And to close my remarks, this is America, and anybody should be able to run for office. I'm one of them, and I came from privilege, and I'm not ashamed to acknowledge it. I had a lot of advantages that other people didn't have, and I'm on a mission to make it easier for others to do the same thing, because if Congress becomes the domain of the wealthy or those connected to it, shame on all of us. That is poor representation. It is certainly not what our founding fathers and mothers wanted, and we've got to get to it. And that is my new Green Deal. It's a different kind of green.
Yeah, and to build on what Dean just said is, this issue is, I think, more important, frankly, than any other issue facing the country right now. If we don't end the corrupting influence of money in our political system, the idea of getting the Green New Deal or getting, raising family wages or developing a really important housing initiative, or driving down prescription drug prices or reducing the influence of the fossil fuel industry in Washington, all of this is dependent on our ability to fix a very broken system. And it's why the Democrats, when we took over the House, the first bill, the bill we assigned H.R. 1, was a major transformation of our democracy and the most significant ethics reform since Watergate. And a big piece of that was about amplifying the voices of the American people by having automatic voter registration and restoring the Voting Rights Act and a whole number of things to make it easier to vote. A big piece of it is about raising ethical standards, and a big piece of it is about trying to reduce the influence of money in our elections with a public financing model, because it is the most pernicious problem we have, because when lobbyists and corporate PACs spend money, they expect something in return. They don't always get it, but they clearly expect something. And I'll tell you an example. I took the no corporate PAC pledge, and I thought, oh, these corporate PACs are going to be so happy. One less person that's going to call them for money. And my chief of staff said, oh, no, they're not. They're going to be furious. I said, what are you talking about? They're going to be thrilled. And you know what? He was right, because they saw that relationship as the way that they had access. And I kept thinking, you can come and ask for a meeting and present your views. You don't have to come to a fundraiser, but they had so equated their ability to contribute to my election with their corporate PAC as either the opportunity to talk to me or to build a, and so they thought this was like taking away their power. And that's how it's been viewed, this sort of transactional stuff. It's not to say they all see it that way, but it's a culture. And, you know, we've got to change that. And if we don't, it will make the work that we have talked about, whether it's on climate or these others, just even more difficult to do and maybe impossible. So this is why we made it H.R. 1. We passed it. The Republican Senate, Mr. McConnell says he will not even take it up because that dark money is the lifeblood of the Republican Party. So right now they have every incentive in the world to protect the existing system. The only way it's going to change is if the American people demand it, and they basically say to those senators, if you don't pass H.R. 1 and get money out of politics, we're voting you out of office. That's really the only way this is going to happen.
And Mitch McConnell likes to say, you know, public money has no place in our elections. And we like to remind him and them that Ronald Reagan himself won an election in 1984 for president. He didn't have to host a fundraiser because it was entirely publicly financed. That's how we did it for a lot of years here, and it worked quite darn well. So we have to remind people of that.
Thank you so much. Before we close out, I'd love it if the Congressman Phillips and Congressman Cicilline would give information to people who want to get in touch with them. What's the best way to get in touch with you to register their questions or their opinions?
rep.phillips@mail.house.gov.
401-729-5600. Do you know, Jacob, what's my email? Do you know? David.Cicilline@mail.
And then also, you're both on Twitter.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, please
He's
follow me
got,
on Twitter.
Dave's got a little bigger following than I do.
We want to thank Jordan Allums and Eamon McKeever. We want to thank the Talbot Institute. We want to especially thank Congressman Phillips and Congressman Cicilline for a terrific hour, and we appreciate your time. And
Thank you all.
they've got to catch a flight to Washington.
Thanks,
to
everybody.
cast some
Thank you.
votes. Thank you very much.
Great being with you, Dean. Thank you.